In this section, we're going to look at how to manage SharePoint permissions and security using Metalogic's Essentials for Office 365. So in order to do that, we need to click on the Security Manager tab. Now this tab contains a series of actions we can carry out and also some reports which sit towards the right where we can carry out security analysis. So you'll notice at the moment everything is grayed out. Well, it will remain grayed out until we choose a scope. So for today, let's go again and choose the finance site. So if I go down and click on that in the navigator, then all the functions start to come to life. So straight away I can start to run some reports. So I can run an object permissions report on the finance site, and that will show me the object permissions for that site. Now, there's a slight delay while each of these reports run because they're all run in real time. So that's now querying the permissions from the tenant right now, and now it will show the results. So these are the object permissions for the finance site. So a couple of things I can do straight away. If I look over to the right here, I can export this report to a CSV report if I wanted to work with it outside of Essentials and do some analysis there. I can also expand out some of the groups that exist here and see who the members are of these groups, and I can make changes to individuals' permissions. So for example, Alex Wibbler here, if I right click on him and choose to edit his permissions, you see he currently has or contribute and also limited access to certain places. So I could remove those and assign him full control to that site and click finish. And shortly after clicking finish, his permissions will be updated to have full control. So it says permission successfully edited. Now if I click on view log, you can see the log item for that permission change there. Now, once again, if I go and look at Alex, his permission level within this view has changed to full control. If I right click and choose edit again, you'll see the checkbox has moved up there to full control. So from there, I can also view the permission levels on this site and view a list of those. So those are now loading. Again, these load in real time, so there's a slight delay while they load, and we'll see these are the permission levels currently available on that particular site. Again, we can make changes to these, so we can right click on full control, for example, choose to edit that permission level and go down and remove one of the values. So perhaps remove the ability for people with full control to manage permissions. Moving along from there, we also have this option which will show the groups that exist on that site. So that will show us a list of the groups. Again, we can expand out the groups and see who the members are from those groups and take some actions on these. For example, you can right click and delete a user from a group, or right click and delete a group if that was required. So next we have the actions section here. So the first option we have along here is create and grant. So we can grant permissions to a user or a group. So I could choose a library, and for example there, choose grant permissions, and then I can grant permissions to a user or a group and specify a permission level. So perhaps full control or design or such. And also add them to a SharePoint group, for example there, approvers or designers. So within this view, I can also create a permission level. So perhaps there's a permission level that would be useful for my organization. So I can give it a name and then choose the permissions I want for this permission level. Now you'll notice when I click manage lists, it's also automatically selected view items because those two things are sort of dependent on one another. So if you select a permission item that's dependent on another one, that will be checked automatically. So I can check the items as required and click finish, and then that will create a permission level in my site, which then I can select when I'm assigning permissions. Staying with create and grant, we have the option to create a group. So you can create a new permission group for that site, which you can then use to assign permissions to users. Finally, within here, we have the option to add a user to a group. So if I went to the users and groups report I've just generated just previously and went down to perhaps viewers and then chose grant add user to group, I can add an existing user like maybe Adele to that group. There she is. Click finish and then she'll be added to that group. Now, the remaining things on the action side, we've got edit and delete. So if we choose a report we've already run, like this permissions report, and I choose edit there, that's the same action as the right-click edit. And similarly, the delete button there is the same as a right-click and delete. So there's other options you have available to you for managing users and permissions once you've run a report. So finally, under actions, we have this drop down here that shows user permissions. So if I click on that, we have the first option here, which is to transfer and clone permissions. So another way of thinking about this is to copy permissions from one user to another, which is a clone, if you like. And the transfer is more like a move. So that's removing the permissions from one user and assigning them to another. So we could work through an example with this. I could put Adele Vance as a source user, and then Alan D as a target user. And now, when I click finish, that will copy the permissions from Adele to Alan. So then they'll both have the same permissions. So that could be useful in a scenario where perhaps you've a new starter joining your team and you want to assign them all the same permissions as an existing user because they'll be carrying out the same role. You can use this clone or copy permissions option. If I check this box at the bottom here, remove all source user permissions, then it becomes a transfer or a move, if you like. So once that checkbox is checked at the bottom there, it will take the permissions away from Adele and assign them to Alan. So an example or scenario where you might want to use that is if you've got a handover. So if someone's leaving the organization and someone's joining to take their place, you can have your handover day where they explain the role, and at the end of the day maybe use this to transfer permissions from one user to another prior to removing that user from your environment. Again, the final thing on this drop down here under user permissions is the option to remove permissions. So you can specify a site scope. It's picked up the finance site because I've already selected it on the left there. And it will populate for a single site, or you can also load multiple sites. So you can create a CSV with the site URLs in column A of a spreadsheet, save that as a CSV, and it will remove their permissions from multiple sites. So let's just stay with a single site for now. I'm going to enter a user, Adele V, check that she exists. There she is, name is valid. And now when I click finish, that will remove her permissions entirely from that site scope. So that's useful again if you needed to remove a user's permissions from a particular site. So next we have this section called security analysis. Now this contains permission reports which we can run to determine the state of permissions within our environment. So firstly, let's look at this report here. Permissions given to user or group. So again, I'll choose the finance site as a scope. I'll click on this button here, permissions given to user or group, and I can select a user. Let's go with Adele again. Adele Vance. Check that she exists. There she is. And now when I click finish, this will run a report showing me all of the permissions Adele has within that site. Again, this report is run in real time, so there's a slight delay while it runs, and then it will start building out the permissions for Adele within this particular site. So here it is, the top level. It's showing a couple of libraries, and the first one here, compose, looks she has permissions inherited. This library here, confidential documents, she actually has full control, and the regular document library also full control. There is actually within this example tenant a subsite as well, and it's loading the permissions for that also. So if you run this report at a higher level, say for example a site collection, it will show the permissions for that user across all the sites and subsites. What's interesting here as well is I can also expand out the library and see which permissions there are for Adele Vance on these individual documents. So if Adele had unique permissions on any of these documents, they would show up here as well. So it gives you a really good indication of that user's permissions across that scope. As before, you can click on this button to the right and generate a CSV report for that report we've just generated if you wanted to work on it perhaps in Excel. Other things you can do within this report, you can right click on a library or list and click view in the browser to load that library in the web browser, or click show permissions and it will show the permissions for that specific library. So if you wanted to investigate something a little further, you can right click and show permissions. So for that particular library, has the link to it up here, confidential documents. Only 2 users really have access, Adele and Alan, and they both have full control. So turning that report on its head slightly, there's this next report, users with permission to objects. So if you select a scope, again, I've chosen the finance site and click users with permission to object, it will show you a list of users who have permission to that particular object. Now, this report is interesting because it also shows external users, if there are any. So as this runs, we can have a look through here, and these are all the users that have permission to this object. And you see down here there is a user with a hash ext hash inside their name, and that is because that's an external user. So that's actually me. I've invited myself into this site in one of the libraries as an example, so I appear there. Within this report, you can also right click and choose to show the permissions for that particular user or group, and it will generate a report showing that user's permissions. So give that a second to load. Again, that loads in real time. So again, these are Adele's permissions for that particular site. So moving on from there, we also have the option to show orphaned users. Now, this report will show users that exist in your tenant, but that do not exist in your Active Directory, effectively orphans. Now, if you've managed your permissions very strictly using Active Directory users and groups, then you shouldn't have any orphans in your tenant. However, if they've been managed in a different way, or you've created lots of SharePoint groups or such, then you may have orphans. And these are users that may be removed from Active Directory but still have some access to your SharePoint environment. So this report will show a list of those, and then if you right click on them, you have the option to transfer their permissions, view their permissions, remove the user, or delete the user from the site collection. So next, let's look at the permission inheritance report. So again, if I run that across the finance site and click permission inheritance, this will show you everywhere permission inheritance is broken throughout the scope you've selected. So I'm running this again across the finance site. And you see where permission inheritance is broken, you get this symbol here with an open padlock, and it says in the inheritance column, inheritance broken, and then all items inherit permissions. If inheritance was broken and all items didn't inherit permissions, it would say there also. So some actions you can take from here straight away. You can right click on the library and choose to inherit permissions and click OK, and that will re-inherit the permissions from the parent. I would be careful before you do that, because when you choose to re-inherit permissions, you can do one of 2 things, well, one of 3 things really. If the unique permissions are the same as the parent, nothing will really happen, they'll just be inherited. If they're different though, you can potentially expose that library to a broader audience of people who perhaps aren't supposed to see it, or a narrower audience if a lot of users had been added manually at that level. So what I would suggest you do first before you choose to inherit permissions is right click on it and choose show permissions. And that will show you a report that shows the permissions for that library. And there it is. And then secondly, I would also right click on it and choose view in the browser and just see what sort of content is in there. I mean, you can also load this in the navigator. That's another option too. So that's showing it in the browser. You can see the documents there, but you can also select that library and go and double click on it here. Select migrator and double click on the library, there it is, and view the contents there if you wish either. It's just slightly quicker to jump to the browser if you're in the security manager view. Okay, so from there, the next thing we can look at is the permissions inventory. Now, this is perhaps the most powerful report you can run from within this section. And what this does is it produces a comprehensive permissions inventory for the scope you've selected, up as far as perhaps a site collection. So I'm going to run it again at the site level, choose permissions inventory, and that opens this window where I can specify my options. So the site URL has been chosen because I've selected it on the left, and I can choose now whether to include sub-site level permissions, permissions, list level permissions, item level permissions. It says here in brackets this may be a time-consuming operation. That just means the report will take slightly longer to generate, but it will be a more useful report. Include inherited permissions, include group permissions. And now I can choose whether I want to save my report to file system or SharePoint. So for today's example, I'm going to save it to a file system. I'm going to put it on my desktop and call it permissions inventory 001. Okay, so now I choose save and finish. The system is going to start generating that report. So if I click on details, you can see the steps that are taking place to build that report. So now the report's generated successfully, I can choose Open CSV to open the permissions inventory report. So the permissions inventory report opens in Excel. So I'm just going to show you a couple of things that we can do to make this easier to read. So firstly, if we select the actual permission columns, so those are G to P. So I'm going to hold down Shift and select that and just make these slightly wider, so we can see our column headings. And secondly, I'm going to go to conditional formatting, highlight cell rules if equal to X. So that will highlight the ones which have permissions in those. And I'm going to just center these as well. And one final thing I'm going to do, I'm going to highlight row 6 and go to view, freeze panes. So now when I scroll up and down, it will maintain my column headings. So and now that we've done that, as we move down the list, you can see it shows the permissions for each level of the site I've selected. So for example, the top level here, we go to user or group Adele Vance and look across, she has full control. As I look down as well, there's actually an external user here, me, Joseph Joby Byrne, and that user has limited access, so they have access to a library lower down in this site. Now, as I scroll down, you'll see it's quite easy to interpret this report because it has the sort of heading of each type of list or library, and then it describes whether the permissions are inherited or unique. So this makes it very easy to spot things that are unusual. Like for example, this library here, confidential documents, the permissions are unique. We've got our extra information with our crosses on the right here, and we can see for this particular library, Adele Vance and Alan DeYoung have full control. So that may be correct or it may not be, but it's very easy to spot. And as I scroll down, we'll see all the other libraries and lists within that particular site. So that's a very powerful report to run, especially at a site collection level, and very useful if you want to do an internal audit to understand the permissions that are currently set, or if you're being audited, if there's an external organization that's come in to perform an audit and they ask you for the permissions or the permission structure on your Office 365 site, you can quickly run that report and then show that to them. So that's permissions inventory. The next report we can run is compare object permissions. So I click on the button compare object permissions, it opens this window and I can choose 2 sites and lists to compare. So I can fill these in manually here, or much easier, I can go into the navigator and select a library, for example confidential documents, and hold down Control and select another library, and now you see all of the buttons have been grayed out except for create grants and compare object permissions. So I click now compare object permissions. It's going to compare the permissions between those 2 libraries, confidential documents and regular documents. So if I expand out the permissions section here, we will see that the confidential documents permissions on the left here, we only have 2 users with access to that library, in comparison to the list on the right here, which have many users and many groups. So you can see then the difference between those two libraries or 2 objects if you wanted to understand how their permissions were different. Finally, we have the option here to identify external users. So I click on a site collection, click on external users. This is going to generate a report showing me all users that have been invited in to the particular site collection and can carry out views or can carry out changes. So if I expand that out, you see there's only 1 user that's been invited into this site collection. That's actually me from my external email account. And from there, I can do several actions. I can right click on this user and remove the external user, or I can also audit the user. So if auditing switched on in your tenant, and we'll look at this a bit more closely when we look at the administrator actions, you can audit the user and view which actions they've been carried out or carrying out within the tenant. So it's a very useful report to show the external users that have been invited into your tenant. This report as well will only show users if your tenant is enabled for external sharing. So it may be that there aren't any because the tenant's not been set up to accept external users. So that's a view of the permissions and security management that we can do with Essentials for Office 365.